The room we have constructed for ourselves is entirely silent. Yet its silence does not feel like the deep, restful quiet of an ancient forest after rain, rather. It feels like the tense, pressurized stillness of a high-security laboratory. We sit in the center of our minimalist sanctuaries, listening to the expensive, faint electronic hum of a medical-grade air purifier that works tirelessly in the corner, filtering out the microscopic, invisible debris of the outer world. The walls are painted in precise, muted earth tones designed to soothe the optic nerve. The sheets are made of undyed, organic linen that has never known the harsh bite of synthetic pesticides, and a single stick of wild-harvested resin burns on a ceramic plate, filling the space with a dry, clean scent that evokes a sacred temple we have never actually visited. Everything within our immediate field of vision is a masterpiece of conscious lifestyle design, a perfectly curated personal ecosystem where light, sound, and atmosphere have been subjected to an intensive, uncompromising optimization process. We look around this immaculate space, and we congratulate ourselves on our high level of self-awareness, our commitment to our mental health, and our deep understanding of nervous system regulation. Yet, if we are entirely honest with ourselves in the dark of the night, we can feel a strange, cold vibration running beneath this pristine surface. We can smell the distinct, sharp undertone of a subtle, pervasive anxiety that characterizes our entire relationship with our environment. It is an anxiety born not from poverty or chaos, but from an overwhelming, hyper-vigilant obsession with psychological and environmental purity. We have become a society of spiritual and somatic curators, individuals who spend an immense amount of our daily cognitive bandwidth trying to construct a life that is completely bulletproof against the unpredictable, messy friction of the ordinary world. We track our sleep cycles, down to the minute on shiny metal rings. We monitor our heart rate variability like flight engineers, overseeing a delicate launch. We categorize our food into complex lists of inflammatory and anti-inflammatory substances, and we screen our social interactions through a rigid vocabulary of toxic behavior, energy vampires, and trauma responses. We have transformed the beautiful ancient human art of living into a demanding, full-time defense campaign, turning our homes into private fortresses where every entrance is carefully guarded against the contamination of the unoptimized world. In this relentless pursuit of a sanitized peace, we find ourselves deeply, fundamentally stuck. We are caught in a brilliant, gilded trap where the cleaner our immediate environment becomes, the more fragile and easily triggered our bodies and minds become when forced to step outside our controlled zones. We have optimized ourselves into a state of acute hypersensitivity. We go out for an ordinary dinner with friends, and the slightly too bright fluorescent lighting of the restaurant hits our eyes like a physical blow, sending a wave of irritation through our temples. We walk down a busy city street, and the ordinary, chaotic smell of exhaust fumes, stale grease, and human sweat feels like an aggressive chemical assault on our delicate nostrils. We sit in an office where a colleague speaks with a slightly aggressive, unmodulated tone, and our hearts instantly begin to beat with the frantic, terrified rhythm of a cornered animal, our minds immediately shouting that our boundaries are being violated and our nervous systems are being deregulated. We have spent so much time and energy creating a pristine, climate-controlled inner climate that we can no longer handle a single degree of external temperature change. We look at our daily schedules and we see that our world has shrunk down to a tiny, predictable loop of safe spaces, safe foods, safe podcasts, and safe people. We have mistaken the total absence of discomfort for the presence of genuine spiritual peace. When we are inside our sanctuaries, wrapped in our heavy blankets with our ambient noise machines playing the sound of a rainstorm in a distant jungle, we feel a superficial sense of control. We tell ourselves that we are doing the deep work, that we are healing our ancestral lineages, and that we are protecting our energy. But this peace is a highly artificial commodity. It is a luxury product that depends entirely on our ability to exclude 99% of the human experience from our awareness. The moment a neighbor plays loud music, the moment a delivery is late, or the moment a family member calls us with a messy, unresolved emotional crisis that does not fit into our therapeutic vocabulary, our beautiful, curated serenity evaporates like morning mist over a hot sidewalk, revealing a raw, angry core of intense entitlement and deep systemic fragility. We have arrived at a peculiar modern paradox, where our spiritual practices have become a form of sophisticated agoraphobia. We use the language of mindfulness, somatic healing, and boundary setting not to open ourselves up to the vast, wild tapestry of life, but to justify a radical, fearful withdrawal from it. We treat other people's unprocessed emotions as if they are infectious biological pathogens, looking at the ordinary, clumsy, and unpolished expressions of human grief, anger, or confusion with a sense of clinical superiority. If someone we love is struggling and speaks to us with an edge of frustration, we do not see their pain, we see a threat to our vibration. We quickly deploy our psychological armor, cutting the conversation short, telling ourselves that we must preserve our peace at all costs. We are so busy defending the perimeter of our sacred sanctums that we have forgotten how to perform the most basic, messy acts of human love, patience, and companionship. We have made ourselves completely clean, but we have also made ourselves completely cold. We feel this coldness as a heavy, unacknowledged loneliness that settles deep in our bones as we sit alone in our perfect rooms. We are connected to thousands of other optimized seekers through the smooth glass windows of our digital devices, sharing tips on supplement routines, breathwork protocols, and somatic exercises, yet we are profoundly isolated from the living, breathing soil of community. We are lonely because we know at a subconscious level that the self we are presenting to the world is not a real human being, it is an engineered product. A pristine exhibition that can only be maintained as long as we stay behind the glass. The authentic self, the one that is occasionally lazy, the one that still craves unhealthy comfort foods in moments of grief, the one that feels an ancient, irrational anger at the unfairness of life, is hidden away in the dark basement of our curated sanctuaries, completely buried under a mountain of spiritual performance. We have built a prison out of our own self-care, and the tragedy is that we are the ones holding the keys, standing guard at the door, terrified of the very freedom that lies just beyond the threshold of our sterilized walls. To observe the full expansion of this modern malady, we must look at the archetypal figure of the hyper-purified seeker, a character whose daily life has become a full-time, unpaid job of intensive internal auditing. This is an individual who does not merely live, they operate a complex biological and psychological machinery with the cold, unblinking precision of a quality assurance inspector. Every morning begins not with a joyful awakening to the light, but with a series of high-precision diagnostic assessments. They lie perfectly still beneath their weighted, organic sheets, tracking the exact quality of their morning saliva, measuring the depth of their inhalation, and checking the notification on their wearable technology to see if their heart rate variability indicates that their nervous system is in a state of high readiness or critical depletion. Their kitchen resembles a modern compounding pharmacy, lined with amber glass bottles, adaptogenic powders, and precisely weighed supplements designed to optimize every neurotransmitter, reduce every marker of systemic inflammation, and maintain an unyielding biochemical firewall against the degenerative modern world. If we look at this person as they walk through a crowded urban transit hub or a noisy office corridor, we see a masterclass in somatic self-protection. Outwardly, they may appear calm, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that they have practiced for years on expensive rubber yoga mats. But if we possess the eye of a trained anatomical observer, we can see that their entire body is actually operating as a hypervigilant defense system. Consider the nostrils and the pattern of their breathing. The nose does not draw in the air with a soft, expansive curiosity. Instead, the nostrils are slightly flared and held in a state of chronic muscular tension. The breath is shallow, micro-filtered, and tightly managed, caught entirely in the narrow pathways of the upper throat. It is a guarded breath, the breath of a diver moving through a polluted underwater cave, or someone who believes that the very air around them is thick with invisible pathogens, negative energetic residue, or the toxic emotional debris of the unwashed masses. They are inhaling just enough to survive, but never enough to taste the world, never enough to let the raw, unfiltered atmosphere of the street drop down into the deep, dark wilderness of the lungs. When we look lower, at the solar plexus and the diaphragm, the structural toll of this hyperpurification becomes even more pronounced. The area just below the breastbone, where the ribs meet, is held in a state of permanent defensive retraction. This is the energetic and physical firewall of the curated professional. It is pulled slightly inward and braced, creating an invisible muscular shield that separates the upper heart from the lower belly. This chronic contraction is driven by a subconscious behavioral loop. The belief that if the core is left soft and receptive, the chaotic, unoptimized emotions of others, their anger, their frantic anxiety, their clumsy demands will penetrate the body and shatter its fragile, hard-won alignment. Because the solar plexus is locked like a vault door, the large, dome-shaped muscle of the diaphragm is physically blocked from dropping downward during inhalation. The organs of the abdomen, the stomach, the intestines, the liver are subjected to a continuous, unyielding pressure, deprived of the natural rhythmic massage that a deep, healthy breath provides. The gut, which science now knows houses the vast majority of our serotonin receptors and acts as our primitive somatic brain, becomes a tight, frozen knot of hypervigilance, leading to chronic digestive sensitivities and a profound systemic loss of pelvic grounding. The skin itself, the vast sensory canvas that forms the outer boundary of our being, reflects this state of brittle isolation. For the hyperpurified seeker, the skin is no longer a porous, breathing bridge that connects the internal life to the external cosmos. It has been converted into a hard, defensive perimeter. There is a subtle, constant holding away of the world that manifests as a microscopic contraction in the erector pili muscles just beneath the surface of the flesh. The body feels thin, fragile, and easily assaulted by the ordinary sensory textures of modern existence. A sudden burst of laughter from a group of strangers, the mechanical clatter of a passing train, the intense glare of a screen, or the heavy scent of synthetic perfume from a passerby does not simply pass through their awareness like a cloud through the sky. It crashes against this brittle outer boundary like a physical projectile, sending a high-voltage shock of irritation directly into the spinal cord. The seeker feels constantly raw, constantly under siege, entirely unaware that their extreme sensitivity is not a sign of high spiritual evolution, but the natural result of their own self-inflicted insulation. The behavioral loop that arises from this somatic state is a self-generating nightmare of escalation. Because the body is held in this permanent state of structural defense, the nervous system remains locked in a low-grade, high-priority survival response. The amygdala, scanning this internal landscape of muscular tension and restricted breathing, concludes that the external world must be an incredibly dangerous place. The mind then seeks logical justifications for this internal panic, projecting its anxiety onto the surrounding environment. The seeker looks at an ordinary social gathering and labels it a toxic environment. They look at a family member's unpolished, messy expression of grief and categorize it as an energetic violation. They look at an ordinary plate of restaurant food and see a collection of toxic, inflammatory poisons. This cognitive diagnosis convinces the mind that the only way to stay safe is to withdraw even further, to buy a stronger air purifier, to implement stricter dietary protocols, and to cut off more relationships using the clinical language of emotional boundaries. The deep psychological root of this obsession is an ancient, unacknowledged fear of our own inherent wildness. We build these curated sanctums and bleach our internal environments because we are terrified of the dark, chaotic, and uncontrollable forces that dwell within our own subconscious minds. At some point in our histories, we came to believe that our natural animal instincts, our primitive anger, our insatiable cravings, our deep existential grief, and our basic human messy inconsistencies were dirty, dangerous, and fundamentally unlovable. We learned to associate our wildness with rejection and chaos. The curated lifestyle we see today is a highly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar defense mechanism designed to keep that internal wilderness at bay. The pristine diet, the rigid somatic tracking, and the clinical lifestyle rules are not acts of self-love. They are the bars of a beautiful, sterile cage we have built to imprison the wild animal of the self. We are terrified that if we let our guard down for a single hour, if we breathe deeply into the soft belly and allow the raw, unsanitized texture of reality to enter our flesh, the cage doors will fly open, and the chaotic, unpolished truth of who we are will rise up and overwhelm us, leaving us exposed, abandoned, and broken in the eyes of the world. To understand the true nature of this sophisticated self-imprisonment, we must turn our gaze toward a structure that occasionally stands on the edges of our oldest botanical gardens. The bleached greenhouse. Imagine an immense dome constructed from thousands of interlocking panels of expensive, high-clarity glass, held together by an intricate framework of gleaming white steel. Inside this dome, the environment is a triumph of absolute climate control. Automated vents adjust themselves to the fraction of a degree. Specialized lamps mimic the perfect spectrum of midday sun without any of its destructive heat, and high-pressure nozzles fill the air with a fine, double-filtered mist of pure distilled water. But the most striking feature of this sanctuary is its absolute cleanliness. Every morning, the keepers of the greenhouse scrub the concrete pathways with a strong solution of industrial bleach. The soil in the planting beds has been baked in high-temperature ovens to kill every single wild microbe, every unmapped spore, every native fungus, and every burrowing worm. It is a space entirely scrubbed of death, decay, and spontaneous biological chaos. Now, let us examine the plants that grow within this hyper-purified sanctuary. They appear magnificent at first glance. Their leaves are a deep, uniform emerald green, free of any insect bites, spots, or tears. They grow straight and exceptionally tall, reaching eagerly toward the artificial light above. But if we dig just a few inches beneath the baked, sterilized soil, we discover a tragic anatomical reality. Because these plants have never had to compete with weeds, because they have never had to push their roots through hard, unyielding stone, and because they have never faced the symbiotic, yet challenging friction of wild soil bacteria and fungal networks, their root systems are shockingly thin and shallow. They possess no deep taproots to anchor them to the core of the earth. They are merely sitting on top of a sterile medium. Furthermore, because the air inside the greenhouse is perfectly unmoving, never subjected to the violent, tearing winds of a wild winter storm, the stalks of these plants have never developed the thick, flexible layers of structural bark and dense cellular fiber that allow a wild tree to bend without breaking. They are giants made of green glass. The moment a single pane of the dome cracks, the moment the power fails and the outside weather forces its way in, these beautiful hyper-purified organisms do not adapt. They collapse, shattered by the very reality they were designed to avoid. This is the exact condition of our minds, when we are caught in the grip of the curated sanctum. The bleached greenhouse is our life when it has been subjected to the aggressive, defensive protocols of modern lifestyle design and spiritual hygiene. We have sterilized our environments, baked our diets, and bleached our relationships, believing that if we can just eliminate every source of psychological friction, we will finally achieve a permanent state of high-vibration enlightenment. But we have only succeeded in making ourselves fragile. We are growing tall but thin, completely devoid of the deep, somatic root systems and the psychological immunity that can only be developed when a human being is willing to stand raw and unprotected in the middle of the wild, unsanitized weather of reality. It is precisely at this point of deep structural fragility that the clean, uncompromising wisdom of the ancient sages cuts through our delusions like a winter gale blowing through a glass house. In the profound psychological treatises compiled by the Awakened One, there is an intense analysis of how human suffering actually operates not as a result of external events, but as a direct consequence of our internal aversion to discomfort. This framework is illuminated by the classic teaching of the second arrow. When an ordinary person is struck by an event in life, a sudden loss, a difficult interaction, an unpleasant sensory experience, or a wave of raw, unpolished human emotion, they experience the first arrow. This first arrow is the natural, unavoidable friction of being a mortal creature with a nervous system living in a volatile universe. It is the cold rain, the rude remark from a stranger, the stomachache, or the sudden rising of ancient grief in the middle of a working day. It is uncomfortable, but it is limited, localized, and inherently temporary. However, for the hyper-purified seeker residing within the bleached greenhouse, the arrival of this first arrow is treated not as a natural event, but as an existential catastrophe. The moment an unpleasant experience penetrates their sanctuary, their mind explodes into a frenzy of defensive judgment and conceptual panic. They drive a second arrow deep into their own flesh with their own hands. They scream internally. This environment is toxic. This person is ruining my alignment. My nervous system is being completely deregulated by this noise. If I cannot stay clean, I will lose all my spiritual progress. This second arrow is the arrow of radical resistance, of spiritual entitlement, and of the frantic demand that the entire universe must be completely sterilized and silent before we agree to be happy. The Awakened One pointed out that the first arrow causes only a minor scratch, but the second arrow, the relentless, aggressive commentary of our aversion, creates a deep, infected wound that can paralyze our entire life. We suffer not because the world is messy, but because we are suffering from an addiction to a purity that does not exist. To break this cycle of self-inflicted fragility, we must use the surgical blade of non-dual wisdom to dismantle the fundamental illusion of the separable ego. The entire architecture of the curated sanctum is built upon a profound philosophical error: the belief that it is possible to draw a hard, permanent line between the clean self inside the body and the dirty, chaotic world outside the skin. We treat our personal energy as if it is an independent, static treasure that must be locked in a vault, away from the contamination of others. But this separation is a complete hallucination, a direct denial of the supreme cosmic law of interdependence. The Awakened One looked deep into the nature of reality and realized that there are no independent borders in the universe. Everything is completely woven into everything else. Everything interbreathes, interexists, and flows through everything else in an unbroken river of arising and passing away. The skin is not a wall, it is a porous bridge. The breath we draw into our bodies in this moment was once inside the lungs of a stranger, a bird, a tree, or a dying animal. The emotions that move through our hearts are not our property. They are the ancient, collective weather patterns of the human species, flowing across our awareness like wind over a vast field of grass. When we try to create a sterile, separate sanctuary for our private ego, we are trying to cut out a single bucket of water from the ocean and keep it from moving, turning it stagnant, dead, and sour. The ancient sages reminded us that true spiritual peace is not found by building a thicker glass dome to keep the mud of the world away. It is found by realizing that the pristine, luminous lotus of our true nature can only grow, unfold, and blossom precisely out of the thick, dark, and unsanitized mud of our actual, raw human existence. The realization that our pristine insulation is a slow form of psychological starvation does not mean we must violently smash our lives into pieces. Rather, it offers us a quiet, revolutionary invitation to unlock the doors of our glass cages from the inside. We stand in the center of our meticulously managed rooms, looking at the silent air purifiers and the organic barriers we have constructed. But now we see them for what they truly are: temporary shelters that have accidentally become our prisons. The work before us is not to seek out trauma or aggressively throw ourselves into destructive situations, but to learn a systematic internal architecture of retraining. We must learn the art of radical organic integration, a method of mind and body cultivation that allows a human being to drop the shield of hyperpurification and develop an unshakable, wild immunity that can withstand any weather the world presents. This retraining begins at the most basic interface of our biology, with the conscious practice of somatic opening to the atmosphere. We return our attention to the flared, defensive perimeter of our nostrils and the guarded, shallow pathways of our breathing. In the middle of our daily routine, especially when we step outside our safe zones into the crowded, uncurated public spaces of our cities, consciously bring our awareness to the act of inhalation. We will notice that the body is automatically trying to hold its breath, sniffing the air with an acute, critical suspicion. We deliberately relax the small muscles around the nose, the upper lip, and the sinuses, allowing the immediate air of the environment to enter the nasal passages without our internal inspection. We let the breath drop straight past the locked gate of the throat, down through the braced firewall of the solar plexus, all the way into the deepest, lowest depths of the pelvic bowl. As we allow this deep, unfiltered breath to move through us, we perform a radical act of structural softening. We locate that tight, defensive retraction just below our breastbone, where we have spent years bracing against the world. We imagine that area softening like a block of ice melting under a warm spring sun. We let the solar plexus expand outward. We let the belly go completely soft and round, releasing the disciplined armor that we have maintained to protect our personal vibration. We allow the raw, unmodulated sounds of our environment, the roar of traffic, the loud chatter of strangers, the clinking of dishes, the slamming of doors to enter our ears and pass directly through our bodies without hitting a single wall of muscular resistance. We train the mind to realize a profound biological truth. We do not need to fight the atmosphere to stay centered. We can let the chaotic world wash through our soft tissues, our blood, and our nerves, treating our bodies not as brittle porcelain vases that will crack at the first vibration, but as vast open spaces of awareness through which the energy of the world can dance without leaving a scratch. Within this open somatic framework, we introduce the practice of intentional soil contact. This is the mental and behavioral discipline of leaning directly into the ordinary friction of life, re-evaluating our definition of what is clean and what is toxic. When we find ourselves in an environment that our old, hyper-purified ego would label as deregulating, perhaps a messy family gathering where people are speaking with unrefined emotions, a chaotic workspace where plans are constantly changing, or a crowded city bus filled with the heavy sensory textures of raw humanity, do not reach for our psychological armor. We do not quickly cut off the interaction or run back to our quiet rooms to meditate. Instead, we plant our feet firmly on the ground, drop our shoulders, and mentally Say to ourselves, this is the soil. This is the exact weight training my soul requires to build true bark. We look at the chaotic environment around us not as a spiritual contaminant that will ruin our alignment, but as the rich, fertile, unbaked mud that contains the vital nutrients our roots have been starving for. We practice being present to someone else's unpolished anger or clumsy anxiety without trying to analyze, diagnose, or correct them, using our clinical therapeutic vocabulary. We drop the superior stance of the observer and allow ourselves to meet them in the bare flesh of our shared human vulnerability. We find that when we stop demanding that our companions speak to us using only approved, optimized scripts, a profound sense of relief enters the space. We build internal muscle by staying present within the friction, realizing that true psychological resilience is not the ability to avoid the storm, but the capacity to be completely broken open by the storm while remaining entirely grounded in our own unshakable presence. As we stabilize this capacity to meet the outer world, we must turn this radical honesty inward, engaging in the most challenging phase of our retraining, welcoming the wild microbe of our own subconscious minds. We step down into the dark, unsanitized basement of our own psyches, the places where we have hidden all our shadow impulses, our ancient unpolished anger, our primitive cravings, and our terrifying inconsistencies. For years, we have used our spiritual practices or clean diets, our high-vibration affirmations, our intensive breathwork protocols as a form of sophisticated bleach, trying to wash away any trace of our base animal nature. But within the architecture of wild wholeness, we realize that a mind that has been bleached of its darkness is a mind that is fundamentally dead. When a wave of dark, unoptimized emotion arises within us, perhaps a flash of bitter jealousy at a colleague's success, a sudden surge of irrational rage at a small inconvenience, or a heavy, gray cloud of existential despair that makes all our spiritual achievements look utterly meaningless, we do not deploy an immediate intervention. We do not rush to fix our chemistry with a supplement. We do not try to track our heart rate variability, and we do not try to breathe the feeling away using a specialized protocol. We sit completely still in the middle of our own inner wilderness. We close our eyes and we open our internal arms wide to the dark emotion, wrapping it in a boundless, non-judgmental presence, whispering to it, "You belong here too, you are part of the soil." We find the physical signature of this wild impulse within our flesh, perhaps as a hot, crushing pressure in the chest, a tight, defensive knot in the throat, or a wild, chaotic buzzing in the solar plexus. We bring our attention to this raw sensation, refusing to bleach it out with spiritual formulas or label it as an unhealed trauma response. Stay with the bare somatic texture of the feeling, letting it burn, letting it ache, letting it expand through our tissues without our interference. And as we stay with it, a miraculous alchemical shift occurs. We realize that this dark energy, when left entirely unsanitized by the second arrow of our judgment, is not a spiritual poison. It is the raw, primal life force of our being, the very fire that gives a tree its strength, its vitality, and its capacity to grow. By welcoming these wild microbes of the shadow, we stop being green glass giants in a bleached greenhouse. We become ancient, complex forest organisms whose roots are intertwined with the full, rich tapestry of life, death, decay, and rebirth. This Renluentum tree requires an uncompromising minute-by-minute discipline that must be executed in the middle of our ordinary, unoptimized days. It is the practice of catching the mind at the exact microsecond when it wants to retreat into its defensive habits. It is noticing the moment your hand reaches to check your wearable ring to see if you are allowed to feel tired, or the moment your throat tightens to deliver a clinical lecture on boundaries to a friend who just needs you to listen. In that precise instant of hyper-vigilant panic, you catch the impulse. You take a deep, unrestricted breath into the very bottom of your soft belly, You drop your shoulders completely under the influence of gravity, you unlock your jaw, and you choose to remain wide open, raw, and unprotected. You train your mind to realize that your safety does not depend on your ability to control your environment, but on your capacity to become completely one with your environment. You become like the wild earth itself, which does not ask for a sanitized rain or a curated sun, but receives everything that falls from the sky with a silent, boundless dignity, turning even the bitterest winter frost into the fertile soil of the coming spring. As this deep, somatic retraining becomes our natural way of walking through the world, we begin to inhabit a space that is entirely separate from the fragile fortresses we once guarded so fiercely. The heavy, sterile atmosphere of the bleached greenhouse begins to dissipate, replaced by the cool, wild, and spacious reality of an unprotected life. This is the dawn of wild holiness, a state of consciousness, where we no longer need the world to be clean before we agree to be at peace. We step out of our hyper-designed rooms and move down into the crowded, chaotic streets of our ordinary lives, and the old, hyper-vigilant radar system in our brains is finally blissfully silent. We no longer look at our environments through the narrow lens of self-protection or energetic contamination. We have dropped the clinical armor, and we are finally resting in the deep, unsanitized dignity of our own bare flesh. The physical experience of this new consciousness is marked by an extraordinary heavy grounding. Our nostrils are soft and open, taking in the full, complex aroma of reality, the exhaust fumes mixed with the smell of wet earth, the ozone of a coming storm, the scent of unwashed human sweat, without a single ripple of somatic resistance. The old, chronic contraction in our solar plexus has dissolved completely, allowing the breath to cascade down through the core of our bodies like a wild river tumbling through a mountain canyon. The diaphragm drops naturally and deeply into the pelvic bowl with every inhalation, massaging our internal organs and connecting us to our deepest, most primitive gut intelligence. Our skin is no longer a brittle wall designed to keep the world away. It is a breathing, porous canvas that absorbs the full impact of living with an effortless, flexible resilience. We move through the noise, the light, and the emotional currents of our families and workspaces with a soft, receptive posture, bending like a mature tree in a winter gale, entirely secure in the structural strength of our own deep taproots. In this state of wild wholeness, we discover the immense, uncalculating freedom of a mind that has surrendered the need for a sanctuary. We realize that true spiritual peace is not a fragile commodity that must be manufactured in a sterile operating room, and protected from the elements. It is an indestructible, natural capacity of awareness that can rest in a crowded subway car, a messy family argument, or a highly stressful professional crisis, with the exact same sovereignty it held in a silent meditation hall. When we are no longer terrified of our own darkness, we are no longer threatened by the chaos of others. We can look at a loved one's raw, unoptimized grief or explosive frustration and meet it not with a clinical boundary or a spiritual formula, but with a wide, undefended chest that says, "Bring your mud here. It belongs in the forest of our relationship." The second arrow has been broken and thrown into the wild earth. We are finally willing to stand raw and bleeding within the first arrow of our immediate, unpolished human reality. We realize as we rest in this spacious alignment the ultimate, radical truth that the awakened one demonstrated throughout his long journey across the earth. He did not achieve liberation by locking himself inside a climate-controlled palace, or by curating a perfect lifestyle of chemical and emotional isolation. He achieved it by sitting directly on the bare ground, under the open sky, with his back leaning against the rough bark of a wild tree. He sat precisely where the insects crawled, where the wild storms raged, and where the dark forces of his own subconscious mind rose up to confront him in the shadows of the night. He did not try to bleach out those dark forces. Nor did he look for a spiritual fortress to protect his personal vibration. He simply sat still, dropped his armor, and touched the raw earth with his bare fingertips, acknowledging that everything, the light and the shadow, the clean and the dirty, the optimized and the chaotic, is completely woven into the single, indestructible tapestry of existence. He reminded us that true enlightenment is not a state of supreme cleanliness, but a state of absolute, fearless, fixed inclusivity. We stand now at the absolute edge of our glass domes, the white steel framework of the greenhouse casting long, irrelevant shadows behind us on the ground. The expensive air purifiers, the wearable rings, and the clinical vocabularies of self-protection are left inside the sterile cages where they belong, no longer needed by a creature that has learned how to live in the wild weather of reality. We look down at our bare feet, sinking slightly into the wet, dark and complex soil of our immediate present, and we feel the immense, heavy warmth of a body that has finally returned home to the earth. The sky above us is vast, unpredictable, and entirely uncurated, threatening rain in 1 hour and offering a brilliant, unfiltered sun in the next. We can choose to step back inside the bleached sanctuary, to adjust our firewalls, to micromanage our diets, and to spend the rest of our days growing tall but thin behind a pane of protective glass. Or we can choose the path of wild wholeness, walking forward into the beautiful, messy and volatile landscape of our tomorrow, with our roots exposed, our armor dropped, and our wild humanity fully alive. As you step forward into the unmapped forest of your life, with all its chaotic demands, its unpolished relationships, and its wild, uncontrollable currents, the question remains entirely yours. What would change in your life if you finally realized that the mud you have spent so much energy running from is the exact soil your soul needs to grow its deepest roots?